Hi, my name is Sarah, and I am the founder of Elf Army of Light. Tonight's International Wave of Light, which is a global collection of memories and support for the pregnancy, loss, and infant death community, I wanted to do something a little different. Here in the United States, we have a election coming up where from the top office of the United States all the way down to county offices, it will affect the lives of millions across the United States, especially when it comes to healthcare and reproductive rights. This is exceptionally important as we know that even prior to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, in 2022, we already had the highest maternal and infant mortality in the developed world, in the United States, and unfortunately in Texas, which is where I am located, it is even worse. And after the trigger laws applied, we have lost tens of thousands more. And even those who did not die have been affected by not being able to have children ever again. And as unfortunately many people do know, those who have had to have abortions already have children. They're already mothers. I wanted to really focus in on the loss that we all have and the mothers who often get left behind and the humanity behind these stories. It is exceptionally important right now, especially that we ensure that we put healthcare in the hands of doctors and those who are going through the worst moment of their lives, rather than in the hands of politicians who know nothing about these situations. Obviously, one of the things that we like to say is that no one should be pregnant without their consent. And then we actually tag on the Star Legacy Foundation's motto of every pregnancy should have a happy ending. And it's because those two pieces go together that we want to make sure that we actually focus on the stories of not only those who have had pregnancy loss and infant death, but those who are currently facing an even greater taboo, even more grief and trauma upon grief and trauma. Tonight, I'm actually going to be reading from these three books. I do recommend them if you or someone you love has been through the pregnancy loss and infant death trauma. The first one is Empty Cradle, Broken Heart, Surviving the Death of Your Baby. The next one is You or Someone You Love. And the final one is In Her Shoes, Women of the Eighth. This is the one we're actually going to be beginning to read from tonight. And then we will finalize with Empty Cradle, Broken Heart. The reason that I want to start with In Her Shoes is because when I talk to people who misunderstand the stories of medical termination, this is often the book that I recommend because it is so often for religious reasons. And sometimes it is very misguided religious reasons, as obviously the majority of people here in the United States do support the woman's right to know what is going on with her body and the privacy therein. And that should be between she, her doctor, and whether or not there is any religion present. The reason that I bring this up especially is because Ireland, um, when they were overturning the eighth, it was a giant conversation because it is a religious country. It is a Christian nation, whether it is Catholic or Protestant. And the big reason that this came about was because of the compilation of stories of grief and heartbreak and just the humanity behind why people have to get abortions. because as we all know, nobody does this for just because. Nobody wants to get an abortion. The reason that many have to is because their very, very wanted pregnancy has had everything go wrong. Our first story that I will read. It was a bright summer's day when we attended the EPAU at the hospital. I had some bleeding, but as I'd had this during my pregnancy with my daughter, we weren't overly concerned. I was a day shy of 12 weeks pregnant, which is when we had planned on going public with this much wanted pregnancy. At the hospital, we sat in a corridor outside the scanning room with other women and worried looking couples. Some apprehensive smiles were exchanged before deep breaths were heard as the next name was called to enter the room. We seemed to be waiting forever, all the while seeing the mix of relieved and not so relieved faces of expectant parents trickle through as they left the room. It was our turn, and we were greeted by a lovely lady who was very engaging and chatty and explained what would happen. She began to scan and take measurements, all the while still chatting away about trivial things like the weather and holidays. It didn't take long before the eye contact lessened and the chatter stopped. Her expression changed enough that I knew something was wrong, so I asked if this was the case. She said she was having difficulty seeing the lower limbs and wanted a second opinion. Her false smile of reassurance was totally lost on me as she left the room and returned with another doctor. Between the two of them, they muttered to each other, scanning and measuring, and after what seemed like an eternity, the doctor turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, but there is something wrong with your baby." Those dreaded words hung there in the air in front of me in a jumble, making no sense, and I just looked at my husband and cried. The baby was measuring very small for my dates and was not correctly formed. They could only find a partial leg and no other lower limbs. The nuchal translucency was measuring high, suggesting a possible chromosomal defect. I felt ill and dizzy and confused, and like I was outside myself looking down on this, like it was a bad movie. This kind of thing doesn't happen in real life, does it? We were told to come back the following day, where a specialist would rescan and go through our options. We left the hospital in the haze and tried to reclaim some normality by picking our daughter up from creche and carrying on with her as if there was nothing wrong. But there was, and we were terrified of what the following day had in store. It took so much courage to even get dressed that morning and go back to the hospital, as if ignoring the appointment might make it all seem like a bad dream and everything was okay. But we attended nonetheless. The doctor rescanned and confirmed the previous day's findings. It wasn't looking good. There was very little fluid around the baby, and the growth was approximately 2 to 3 weeks behind what it should be. He started spouting off words that meant nothing to me. Edwards, Patau's, Turner syndrome. He also said, "Don't Google anything, whatever you do. You'll only freak yourself out." It all whirled around my head like a storm. An amniocentesis was scheduled for just under 7 weeks' time, when our baby would hopefully reach a gestational size of 15 to 16 weeks. He warned us of potential miscarriage in the meantime and to come straight back to the hospital should any further bleeding occur. He gave us a leaflet on amniocentesis and another on miscarriage, and we were sent on our way. The weeks that followed were a blur. Only for my then 4-year-old daughter, I saw no reason to get up or dressed or even to eat. My husband's birthday came and went without fanfare or celebration. We were too devastated, not thinking things could get any worse. How wrong we were. A week after that awful news, I began to hemorrhage. We felt this was it. I was losing the baby. I went to hospital and was admitted, terrified by the amount of blood leaving my body and for what was to come. They put me in a room opposite the labor ward where all the mothers and families of the healthy babies about to be born were celebrating. The chairs outside my room were taken up by happy family members chatting about their new arrivals. As I listened from my bed, my hope and will passing out of me in scary clumps. The next morning, the master of the hospital arrived in my room with a group of student doctors and spoke of my case to them as if I were a case study in a book. Some sympathy was offered. I'm sorry you had to go through this. Miscarriage is a terrible thing. Would you like us to call the bereavement midwife? So I was definitely having a miscarriage. This was it then, the end of my pregnancy, nature taking its course. My bleeding had subsided to my great relief, but what of the baby? A mobile ultrasound machine was brought into my room, and there it was, beating away. That tiny heartbeat. Relief and worry merged in a confused ball inside of me. What was happening? Was I still going to lose the baby? They saw the heart beating, saw the bleeding subside, explained how the miscarriage was likely to happen, and I was sent home with the same miscarriage leaflet I had received a week earlier. It was a wait and see game. This dance went on 3 more times over the course of the next few months. For each admission, I was back in a room in the labor ward. Bleeding would subside. There's the heartbeat. They sent me home. At each scan, there was less and less fluid around the baby, which they said was needed to support and protect the baby from the pressure of my body. The baby wasn't growing, and all signs were proving the baby was in severe trouble, and this wasn't going to end well. Every day was utterly terrifying. I was afraid to sleep in case I would bleed out in the night, leaving my husband and child without a wife and mother. I lived far from the hospital, so I had to stay with my mother nearby, away from my husband and daughter. I couldn't be left on my own in case I hemorrhaged again, and I was already weak and depressed. I cried uncontrollably. It encompassed my every moment. I worried about the lack of fluid around my baby and him being crushed. It was like a terrible nightmare that I just wanted to wake up from. I felt invalidated, uncared for by my country, unimportant, merely a vessel. It was all about the baby who was slowly dying. I felt I was too. By the third hemorrhage, I was desperate for them to do something, but they couldn't. It was like death by 1,000 cuts for both of us. The day of the amniocentesis came, and the specialist began to scan for it, but it didn't take long for him to validate what I already suspected. The baby had died, and it wasn't recent. He indicated the broken skull on the screen and that there was no more fluid around my baby. I tried to hold it together, but I couldn't. I cried like I never cried before. A sound came out of me that I didn't recognize, but I now know whatever that sound was, it was a mix of pain and relief. I felt so guilty for feeling that way. I loved and wanted my baby, but I didn't want all this pain and suffering. It should never have gone this way. A couple of days later, I was taken in, and they induced labor. I felt every contraction, every urge to push, as if I were about to deliver a healthy baby, except I wasn't. And by early evening, my baby was born still. I asked the midwife if it looked like a baby. She shook her head and said it looked very deformed, so I chose to keep the memory of what I had seen on the ultrasound screen so many times before in my head as the image of my baby instead. She took the baby away. The following day, I was discharged from the hospital. I had labored the day before, having gone through the same contractions as other women leaving with their babies. As I descended the stairs, a happy new father brushed past me in the corridor with a car seat and his new baby daughter asleep inside, and the brightness of possibility in his eyes. And I realized then the emptiness I felt at leaving with nothing but the trauma and pain I had endured in the preceding 6.5 weeks. We found out she was a girl. We named her. She deserved a name. She mattered. Later, we were told she had an incredibly rare neural tubal defect called ceratomelia, or mermaid syndrome. Her lower body never fully formed and never would. What would have been legs were fused and formed what looked like a mermaid's tail. She had no kidneys, no bladder, no genitals or openings of any kind in her lower body, which is why she was unable to process or produce amniotic fluid. She had no hope. She was buried in the hospital plot, and we visit from time to time, but she is with me every moment of every day. It was known from that first scan that this was a very troubled pregnancy, doomed not to continue to the end, And yet, all the while, the medical professionals could do nothing for me or for my baby. The Eighth Amendment prolonged our suffering to the point that she was crushed without the support of the necessary fluid needed to protect her. She was never going to survive. Where was the Eighth Amendment's so called protection of the unborn then? How was that a dignified end? It wasn't. That is why the Eighth needs to go. Yes, she mattered. Yes, she left an indelible mark on our lives. Yes, I will never get over this and the extended and unnecessary trauma of this, the most horrific time in my life, all at the hands of the Eighth Amendment. We need to stop treating women so badly in this country. We need to trust women to know what is best for them with the support of their family and healthcare professionals. This does not belong in our Constitution, and as long as it does, women like me will continue to suffer needlessly. This resonated highly with me because it is so similar to what my husband and I went through with my daughter. Our next story also comes from In Her Shoes. 8 years ago, myself and my husband were days away from the induction of our second son. I was almost 39 weeks pregnant. We had all the plans made, baby grows, baby hat, teddy bear, all ready for his arrival. However, these plans were not made for his life, they were made for his death. At our 31-week scan, we discovered that not all was well with our much wanted son. We had brought our first son to the scan with us so he could share in the excitement of his new sibling. The scan went on for what felt like an eternity. We were oblivious until the doctor said that there was an issue with our son's heart and brain. There was no consultants there for us to talk to, so we were sent home and had to come back a few days later. After 2 further appointments and an amniocentesis, it was confirmed that our beloved son had Edwards syndrome, and my son would not live after birth. We immediately asked about having an early induction, but were told we're not allowed to at that time and would have to wait until I was full term before an induction could be done. It was a process that we had to go through. We received no other choices and we were sent on our way with instructions to come back every week for a scan. The following weeks and scans were horrific. Going into the maternity hospital every week to see if our son was still alive was unbearable. I had 2 mental breakdowns. One happened on my birthday, and I was hospitalized for 4 days. My mind had gone into shock, and my body started to violently shake. I was not able to stop the shaking. The doctors thought I could be helped by thinking happy thoughts. It was decided that I needed to be medicated. I was unable to look after my son, so my mother had to move in with us. My husband had to continue to work every day, pretending all was okay with the pregnancy. How he managed, I'll never know. He was also planning our son's funeral and helping me through the many hysterical crying fits. We clung to the hope that our son would live through his birth so we could look into his eyes and he could feel our kiss before he died. However, knowing that we would have to watch him die in our arms just haunted us. After 8 weeks of hell, we arrived at our induction date. We were sent for our final scan, and there was no heartbeat. We were too late. He had died approximately 4 days earlier. All that suffering was in vain. We would never get that kiss after all. The following morning, our son came silently into this world. He was so fragile, and he was the first dead person I'd ever touched. Our hearts were shattered. We had his funeral 2 days later. His teddy bear with him in his tiny white coffin. He was buried with my grandmother. 8 years later, I am still profoundly affected by our experience. Our choice was to have an early induction, but the eighth said we couldn't. We had no choice, nothing. I was forced to be life support for our dying son for 8 weeks. 8 weeks. However, we consider ourselves lucky. We got to say goodbye to our son in our own country. We left the hospital with our son's tiny white coffin between us in the back of a funeral car. He had a lovely funeral. We were surrounded by our loving family at all times. Was it worth waiting 8 weeks? My answer is no. The mental and physical torture was too high a price to pay. It should never happen to anyone. The eighth must be repealed. Please give us parents the choices we deserve. Not every pregnancy has a happy ending or is black and white. Please vote yes. I beg you. Thank you. Our last one from In Her Shoes is very short. I lost my firstborn 2 years ago at just 6 months old to a terminal genetic condition. We were told it was unlikely to happen again, so we started trying for another little one. I'm now just over 14 weeks pregnant, and last week we received results from a CVS test. It has happened again. Our desperately wanted and loved baby is also sick. We were told this in a very kind and gentle way, and then that was it. No help, no phone numbers, no direction in which to go. I spent the last week trying to contact hospitals in the UK to see if they could take us. Having to explain and ask if we could talk to someone about a termination several times made this awful, heartbreaking situation so much worse. This has broken me. We were lost after losing our firstborn, but it was a terrible situation that nobody had control over. This, however, is just cruel, pure and simple. I hate this country and its old ways of just ignoring the problem until it goes away. Having to wait a couple weeks, grieving the baby I still have growing in me, is a torture that no woman should have to go through. I'm so sad and so angry. The procedure will be done on Wednesday in the UK, away from our supportive families in a country we don't know. We have been abandoned, and it's so cold and cruel. I've never felt so alone. You can see with just a few stories how powerful the humanity behind it was to be able to overturn this horrifically cruel law. And the same needs to be done here in the United States. And unfortunately, we didn't learn from these stories, which were published in 2018. We need to learn. Women and babies are dying. This I found really powerful because so many people have such a misunderstanding on what termination for a medical reason is, but also just why people do have to have terminations. Again, this isn't something that you would choose just because. This is because you were either pregnant without your consent or everything has gone wrong. And even when we do lose an infant or have a stillbirth, and it doesn't have to be an abortion, women hear the most terrible things from people trying to be helpful. And we've all said these things at one point, whether when we were young or because we didn't know better. And I'm hoping that now with the education and with some of these taboos broken, that people will hear these less often. Our first one is called Abortion is a Crime. It's strangely quiet for an early Friday morning at the clinic. Even the street noise from our regular protesters seems muffled, subdued, as if underwater. Later, the clinic escorts and patients will report that the group has added plastic baby dolls to their arsenal of weapons and are brandishing them at passerby as they threaten, "We will adopt your baby, and God made you to be a mother." In our morning huddle, usually a raucous gathering, we are solemn. Someone goes quietly and unsmiling down the list of patients, listing their procedures and any relevant details we know. If someone needs an interpreter, if someone has reported that an abusive partner might show up at the clinic today. We discuss contingency plans, preparation needs, safety questions for each and every person on the list, hoping to get each and every one of them in for their abortions and then out to live their lives and to do it as quickly and as safely and as thoroughly as we can, to be both their soft landing place and their fortress secure, swiftly moving, well-oiled machine of care. To move like water and adapt to any and everything that comes up. Someone goes to make another pot of coffee. The phone rings. It's 8 a.m. on June 24th, 2022. The first patients are arriving. The ruling comes down after 10 a.m., just as we expected. The first thing I see is a nurse practitioner crouched in the hallway outside of an exam room, crying. Then my boss emerges from her office, cell phone in hand and tears in her eyes. She extends her arms, wraps me in a tight hug. I really thought we had until Monday, she whispers. That's when I fall apart, too. Our clinic operates in a state where abortion access is protected, so we will continue seeing patients as if it is any other Friday. We have a full waiting room and 11 in-clinic abortion procedures left to go. Some patients call us from their cars, their bus rides, or their homes, confused and afraid, asking if they can still come for their appointment. Others don't show up at all. I say a silent prayer each time an appointment time comes and goes, that it's because the person has made a different decision, not because they're scared or think that their appointment is now suddenly illegal. In other clinics across other states, it's chaos. Patients pulled from their exam rooms and told they must go home, still pregnant. Staff making hundreds of phone calls, telling shocked and weeping mothers and teenagers and partners and all the other people who can't be pregnant for 1 second longer that their appointments have been canceled. Don't come. They have to tell their distraught and terrified patients, don't come. Elliot in Ohio speaks to two separate patients who tell her they would rather die than have another baby. In the background of one conversation, she hears an infant wail and wail inconsolable. In Texas, when the announcement is made that everyone in a clinic's waiting room must leave, that none of them will be able to have abortions today, a patient clutches at a nurse's arm and begs her for abortion pills. She offers money, pleads and pleads. It's a crime now, the nurse tells her. There's nothing she can do. Increasingly, community care work will mean supporting people through continuing the pregnancies that they wanted or needed to end, supporting them through the fetal diagnoses and miscarriages and stillbirths and complications and dangerous births and injury and suffering and the violations and the theft of the futures they had dreamed, the futures that rightly belonged to them. And we will know as we do this that they should never have needed these forms of care at all. I'm going to read a story about how someone much like me grew up in a fundy environment and then realized that everything they had been taught wasn't right, and that the vitriol and the hate that they had been told occurred was actually only on their side. Growing up in a rural community, Tessa remembers the intense social conservatism and the angry anti-feminist sentiments of her military family. There was a lot of talk of sluts, single mothers, and babies born out of wedlock. Sex and pregnancy were always a woman's responsibility, and it was her fault. 2 years before Tessa's first abortion, she was a fresh-faced first-year undergraduate student, eagerly searching her state university's campus bulletin boards for flyers about the club she already knew she wanted to join, Students for Life of America. You may know Students for Life of America, also known as SFLA, or just by the concise misnomer, Students for Life. By their branding, we are the pro-life generation. Their bold, jewel-toned posters and shirts proclaim at their marches and demonstrations, belying the fact that nearly 70% of Americans under 30 believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, according to the Pew Research Center. Tessa's childhood and adolescence had taught her very well in the matters of belonging, believing, and behaving. As I click through the sections of its website to read about Students for Life's various programs for youth, one of which is represented by a childlike icon of a yellow school bus, I imagine little Tessa among the groups crowded into the classrooms and summer camps of the organization's stated methods therein. I see her big brown eyes and monogrammed backpack in every sentence of their official strategy, in their words, targeting young people during their crucial developmental years. That formative education is why, before the abortions that would save and also create her life. She was wandering her college campus looking for the inaugural meeting of the student club whose self-proclaimed mission was, and still is, to abolish abortion. She can recall in vivid detail, all these years later, as we sit together in her living room, the moment she finally triumphantly became a member of her college's chapter. It was one of her first priorities as a freshly arrived student, both because she wanted to make friends and because she was deeply passionate about the organization's cause. She felt deeply that abortion was killing a baby and that it was incumbent upon her and all good people to stand up against it. I was like, dead babies are bad, full stop, she tells me with a wistful laugh. She describes the t-shirts they wore, which bore tiny footprints, the very same footprints printed in pink and blue on my son's hospital-issued receiving blanket when he was born. Baby footprints. The group met frequently and made themselves a vocal presence on campus. Some were the kind of politically conservative young people one might see crowding the front row of a service at a suburban megachurch, eyes closed and hands raised in worship, tears streaming down their faces. Some were the kind who might mix American flag iconography with Bible verses, silhouettes of guns, and abstract crucifix designs on the throw pillows and fleece blankets that decorated their dorm room bunk beds. And some, like Tessa, were less politically expressive, certainly less overtly religious, and concerned themselves more frequently with humanity and concepts like kindness and peace than with hell and who might be going there. When they caught wind of the fact that their university's rival club, called Students for Choice, was planning to host a talk that would be given by a local Planned Parenthood representative, they decided they would crash the event. Tessa naively assumed that this would entail some sort of peaceful protest outside the lecture hall where the talk was to be held. But when she arrived wearing her SFL baby footprint t-shirt and ready to take a silent, non-confrontational stand against abortion, the president of the group led them all through the doors into the SFC event, which was already in progress. She led them up the aisle to the hall's back row of seats, holding their brightly colored poster boards bearing Sharpie-drawn slogans like pro-woman, pro-baby, pro-life. Women deserve better than abortion. They sat. The SFC members, stunned, look at one another, unsure how to proceed. There were whispers, heads turning back to steal quick glances at the crew in their matching shirts and stony expressions. Tessa quickly realized watching these students, even though they were the bad guys, the baby murderers, they were afraid. The tension in that lecture hall, she tells me, was unbearable. If the speaker from Planned Parenthood noticed the seismic shift in the mood of the room, she took care to stay focused on the task at hand. She blinked once, confused, but smiled as she continued her talk. She was a petite woman who looked to be not much older than the undergraduates in front of her, and her face is burned into Tessa's memory. She had dark and curly hair, wore a yellow sweater, and had a warmth and a brightness to her that Tessa says she won't ever forget, watching darken and dim as the Students for Life took their stand in that too warm and too quiet auditorium. At first, their interruptions were sporadic, a hand raised here, a question shouted there, but then the SFL escalated, employing more aggressive tactics in an attempt to provoke an emotional response. Can you explain why you think killing babies is okay? One of the leaders calls out. The Planned Parenthood speaker wavered momentarily before continuing. She was immediately interrupted by another voice from the back row. How does it feel when you kill the babies? The speaker faltered and fell silent. Tessa noted that her hands were shaking. She was quiet for a moment, then continued her lecture, but her voice dropped out of her words. Her chin quivered. She started her sentence again, her eyes wide and her arms hugging herself in the universal body language of self-protection. Her posture was shrinking. Tessa's heart pounded in her ears. Was she doing the wrong thing? The students who had been quietly sitting in this lecture hall hadn't been bothering her. They were the enemy, sure, the baby killers, but they were also young and idealistic, like Tessa and her friends, and wanted to help people. They thought they were doing the right thing, just like her. A sudden, powerful urge to smooth out the unbearable tension, to bridge the gap in the room, to somehow connect the two groups of impassioned student activists overtook her body. Before she even realized it was happening, she was raising her hand. The speaker ignored her, expecting more harassment, so she rose to her feet. She called out, hopefully, maybe Students for Life and Students for Choice could unite to educate people about birth control so there will be fewer abortions. The speaker sighed, resigned, and gave a nod. Planned Parenthood absolutely provides and supports access to methods of birth control. Tessa was pleased, feeling she had found some common ground. But as she lowered herself back into her seat, she saw two of the Students for Choice exchange an exasperated eye roll. She was confused. Hadn't they just been excited about promoting birth control on campus? She looked to her left and was shocked to find her own group's leaders glaring at her. We consider birth control to be an abortifacient, Tessa, the leader hissed in a rage-filled whisper. Her eyes narrow, she turned back to the front of the hall and shouted, "Murderer." At that moment, it hit Tessa square in the chest, the full weight and velocity of the realization that had been brewing to a boil from the moment she took her seat, uninvited in that lecture hall. Her friends didn't care about saving babies, at least not nearly as fervently as they cared about controlling and policing the bodies of other adults. Suddenly, she didn't want to be here. Or did she? She was interested in what the speaker from Planned Parenthood had to say. She was interested in what the Students for Choice had to say. She wasn't sure she supported abortion or what it would look like if she did, but she knew she wasn't a student for life. She knew she didn't feel whatever it was her friends were preaching. She put her poster board quietly on the ground, picked up her backpack, and stood. She exited the row, ignoring the anger radiating off of her fellow club members as she brushed by their knees. When the echoey lecture hall closed behind her, she steadied herself, feeling dizzy and sick. She wandered the building's dimly lit basement hallway until she found a restroom. Tessa studied her reflection in the warped and streaky mirror above the sinks. She ripped off her club t-shirt with its baby footprints and its anti-abortion slogan and dropped it, disgusted, into the large metal trash can overflowing with tampon wrappers and used paper towels. About a year after her last abortion, she enrolled in the volunteer clinic escort program at the same Planned Parenthood where she was shown such concern and kindness as a patient. Part of her volunteer training found her inadvertently left alone for a moment in a room of paper medical charts. Without thinking, she searched for her last name and grabbed her own chart with its descriptions of abuse and injury and psychological state, of previous pregnancies and sexual history. She still has the chart to this day, several pages of typed and handwritten clinical notes in a nondescript manila folder, and she keeps it with other important records and documents. I asked Tessa what it feels like to look at that medical chart now and what she felt in that moment when she spontaneously stole it from the clinic's files. She shrugs her shoulders, smiles big, and releases a musical laugh. My only thought was, and still is, this is private information, she says. It belongs to me. This is mine. Our last excerpt is going to be from Empty Cradle, Broken Heart. This one is really about making sure we do take care of ourselves with memory days like today, or with the anniversary of when our baby should have been born, or the anniversary of when they were born. It's really important to practice self-care. Practicing self-compassion can significantly reduce your suffering. As Emerson correctly observes, self-care is not about self-indulgence, it's about self-preservation. It's not selfish or optional. Self-forgiveness is another critical piece of self-compassion. If you're holding yourself or your body responsible for your baby's death, there is much healing that can come from forgiving yourself for not being the perfect mother, whatever that means to you. Another way to think about it, what if another bereaved parent came to you and said she was disappointed in her body, her reactions, or her decisions during this most traumatic time of her life? What would you say to her? Would you hold her at fault? Self-compassion is extending yourself the same empathy and forgiveness. Know that you can be a good parent and still have regrets. This is an example of what I mean by hurtful comments that can come from what is intentionally a good place. Unsettling remarks. Some of the comments have been nothing short of shocking. I've been told just to get on with it and have another, and if Addison can somehow be replaced by another baby. Somebody asked me, "Why did you name him?" It was just a miscarriage. One well-intentioned friend said she didn't consider Sam to be a baby yet. I think she was trying to help by minimizing the loss. This was after Oren and Miriam, too, and she made it clear in that her mind only Oren was a baby. But Sam and Miriam were babies to me. And even if I only thought of them as an embryo and a fetus, they were my embryo and my fetus, and I was their mom. I had my share of insensitivity. An elderly neighbor said, "Isn't that funny? That this other lady could have quadruplets and you couldn't even have one." When the twins were born prematurely, somebody told me, "Well, at least you have 2 extra income tax deductions for this year." Someone said to me, "Don't worry, I know a woman who had 13 miscarriages before she had a baby." I thought, oh God, I don't want to hear that. She was trying to help, but that was not really the right thing to say. Platitudes like "it's all for the best" fall flat even when a baby has severe problems. There may be much suffering and heartache during the baby's brief life, and parents have so much love and care invested that their baby's death is still very difficult to bear. When Casey died, many, many people said, "It's better this way." They didn't take care of my Casey. They didn't stay up with her all night. They didn't take her to sometimes 3 or 4 doctor or therapy appointments a day. They didn't hold a screaming baby, knowing there was nothing that could be done but to love her and make sure she was as comfortable as possible. She will always be in our hearts. Don't ever tell a grieving parent it's better this way. This is an example of how, even though people do mention that it's for the woman's health or the baby's health, or that these extremely cruel and hurtful policies are for the purposes of this, that maternal and infant mortality spike when abortion is legal. That those of us who are bereaved parents very much understand how much things can go wrong in a pregnancy, in a birth. One of the things that I experienced after the death of my daughter was when I was in an outpatient extensive therapy group. One of the girls in my class had mentioned that the night before, her brother and her sister-in-law actually had lost their baby because she had died with the umbilical cord wrapped around her throat as she was being born. There is no safe time for a pregnancy. There is no safe moment when you can think everything is okay now. So many of us had such hopes and dreams, whether it was with our miscarriages or with our stillbirth or with the one that did survive. It was an extremely traumatic moment at every moment of that pregnancy, of that birth, of that first year. And this is why we have to show compassion and humanity. This is why these stories are so essential to share. This is why elections are important. Obviously, we are a nonprofit and we're not going to say, here is who to vote for. What we will say is that don't vote for someone who is going to demean and belittle you and your experiences, or that tries to tell you that you should demean and belittle somebody else. Because if we actually do have reproductive rights, if we do have healthcare, if we do have access to birth control, if we do have access to the healthcare that will let us know that something is wrong, and to be able to actually take care of that fetus, of that embryo, of that baby before it kills us or before that baby has to suffer, that is what is needed. That is the story of the doctor and the parent. It is not the story of the politician that wants to make the choice for them. The rest of our time we will give over to our memorial. Thank you.